Yes, good morning, everybody, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going to speak about the review I did for the government in London, but also to comment about one or two other related things. And, oops. I've always designed buildings that are complex and are connected to the urban environment. And it's all part of a continuum, in my view, that parks, transport, and traffic, particularly pedestrian, history and conservation, all these are interlinked in any individual architectural project. I always show this one because everyone knows it from the Bond theme and the Bond films, and it's still there, in spite of it being blown up. But it is part of an urban project. It is, we are replanning the traffic and the bus station and the high street for a considerable area around. And it is now 25, 30 years old, but we have continued for that 25, 30 years, master planning all the area around it. And so that continuity is part of a great interest in places like Hong Kong and London, and in particular those two cities. We began in London with the Peak, but the most complex three-dimensional master plan we did was the West Kowloon Station Master Plan, and that has extended in recent times to work on the master planning of the cultural district, and of late the M+ arts facility, which we're doing with Herzog de Meuron in front of the completed West Kowloon master plan. That interest in how things connect together and the origins of place being so important even to the smallest individual building was exemplified in the book I wrote some 5, 6 years ago now, in which the layers of landscape is always the first starting point. In London, it was the Thames and the valley. And here in Hong Kong, it's the mountains, the islands, and of course, the harbor. The next element is the infrastructure, the engineering, as Carrie referred to it, and then places, the actual places that begin to evolve within the city. And last of all, it's architecture and buildings. I'll come on to the review I did for government. It was all part of a chain of thinking about the city, which I'll refer to later. I took on this review, which was for the coalition government, as it was then. I was asked to by the Minister, Ed Vasey. And I particularly wanted it to be independent. So I said I'd do it for nothing, and I did. We wanted to demonstrate that we were independent of government, and it, in fact, was taken up by all the other major parties very enthusiastically. I was very intrigued how certain departments of government are unchanged, like the Treasury, the Home Office, and the Foreign Office, whereas the Ministry of the Built Environment has been chopped and changed endlessly since 1945, and beyond, and earlier than that. It has been divided up between transport, housing, local government, and then it's recombined. It has no real home, and yet it's fundamental to everything. And I think this is a reflection of whether it's a specialism or whether it is a generalism. And I think that's a very fascinating issue, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This is a page from the review. We made 60 recommendations. There was a hierarchy of them. There were 4 main principal areas, and education was one of them. And we always illustrated these visually. All the recommendations are in this kind of sketch format, because I think increasingly we're returning to a visual age, I think mostly through the internet and digital communication. And this is an example of a page from the review, and it was about children's education, that we felt that it was never too soon to learn about the built environment. And rather than it being a specialist subject, we felt that strongly that it should be embedded in all kinds of other subjects, so that technology had an element about a built environment in it. So did geography, so did science, history, art, and IT, and so on. And the aspects of the built environment that pupils would learn about, and we've been applying this to schools locally to us in our office, are subjects like my home, my street, my town, aesthetics, sustainability, culture, and other things that could be broken down in this way. In order to do this, though, there needs to be better online resources for the teachers. The teachers need training tools, and the classrooms need teaching aids. We weren't at every turn looking to the government. We were not saying all the time, government should do this, government should do that. In fact, we aimed it mostly at the world of the business of a built environment. In other words, the professionals, the teachers, the planners, and of course the politicians. But it was felt that built environment very strongly should be a part of everyone's life, as it is. We all go out there into the streets, we all walk, we all experience traffic and transport and so on. And in that sense, it is a holistic thing, and it can't be one department. It can't be singled out. And so we've proposed a common foundation year for all built environment students, so that if you're going to study planning, landscape, architecture, conservation, or engineering, which all makes up the acronym PLACE, all of those subjects should be combined in a first year, rather like an art school does with the foundation year. And I'm sorry Carrie Lamb isn't here, because I would have said, we have included engineering in this. But that's a particular issue in China and in Hong Kong, because engineering, particularly big engineering, civil engineering, does tend to dominate in the early stages of city making. Of course, lots of people have said you've missed out some of them. So the acronym could equally stand for many other things. It could be politics, it could be law. I always think architecture is there, whatever happens, but I would. Construction, and maybe ecology. But the point really is that it is a holistic, participatory thing that makes up place. I do believe that the planning system in all countries is not proactive enough. We now have tools, digital tools, to make interaction between community members much greater than it used to be. But we have, and most countries have, a reactive system. So how do you build proactive planning? How do you engage with people? I think that's a real challenge, because in my experience, there is enormous interest, there is enormous creativity in all kinds of people from all walks of life, of all ages, of all genders and ethnicity. How do we establish a proactive planning has occupied an awful lot of my thoughts. The place reviews, I feel very strongly about, we have a thing called design reviews, which tend to be triggered only when there is a planning application and there's something new happening. But I did argue that there ought to be place reviews for existing places, for the streets outside here, for how the jockey club and the race course fits in, or how a housing scheme that is now 20, 30 years old, or a hospital. And I particularly focused on hospitals because they often, this is Dundee Hospital from the air, the hospitals often had a plan initially and have been added to just like a piece of the city. And the car parks have been distributed ad hoc, and gradually over time, non-plan takes over. And I felt there ought to be a place review of things like hospitals. I particularly was fascinated by architects' elitism. This is the Maggie's Centre in Dundee by Frank Gehry. It's in the little red circle there. It's won all the architectural awards. And that's what architects queue up to have their photograph taken next to and so on. Meanwhile, the hospital itself is going to hell. The corridors, the wards, the housing for nurses, all of it is below standard environmentally, in placemaking, and so on. And this is another one. This won every award going. This was Maggie's Centre in, which are very worthwhile things, but it's fascinating how architects solve the bit to one side that is soluble all on its own, like a world of its own in a bubble. And this was designed by Richard Rogers' firm. And this is the Charing Cross Hospital, which again, I think should be the subject of a place review. Then returning to the recommendations, we thought that it was feel very strongly that decision makers, not in this case Carrie Lamb, but many other decision makers that are involved in planning reviews, politicians that are making decisions about the built environment, should receive training in design literacy, understanding plans, building types, density, land uses. And I believe this is not just decision makers politically, and this is all kinds of levels of decision making. Relative density is, I find, absolutely fascinating. What is the density of the neighborhood you live in? What is the density of the town? This is literacy at a very important fundamental level, but people don't know. We in the professions don't know the relative densities of where we live, where we work, and indeed how it compares with other cities. And one other area that I feel very passionately about is that every town and city should have an urban room, by which it's an exhibition space, a learning space, a community space. It's somewhere you explore your past and help and plan your future. It particularly has large-scale models. It can happen on a district level, neighborhood level, but it's most important, I believe, it should happen on a citywide level. And I think it should not be owned by City Hall. It shouldn't be owned, because otherwise it becomes a tool of what they want to have you think about the city. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's biased. I think it should be shared between 50-50 between the public and the private sector. We have, as a result, had 50 urban rooms sprout up around Great Britain. We have a local one at Church Street. We have one for Sheffield, and one at Bristol, and a particularly good one at Blackburn. We also were interested in virtual urban rooms. Through the web, through social media, it's possible to communicate new plans, new ideas about the city and city form and the history of your region or your district or your neighborhood. And as a result, we have identified all kinds of subjects that where we can't, as a small practice, lead, and we want it to be spread. So we've worked in groups. School and education and teacher training is one. Place Alliance, urban rooms. We have identified each of these sectors and each of these recommendations, a group that will follow them through and pursue them and make them realize. And they all have an umbrella group that was voluntarily formed called the Place Alliance. I will now just turn to some of the things that I feel strongly about and relates to the Place Review and the Farrell Review. And it has been a very significant passion of mine to regard place as the client. In other words, it is a free body of work. I look at a place, I look at a piece of territory, and I say, well, what does this mean? What does it want to be? What's the possibilities of this place? Without having any client, because if it was, as this is the Royal Parks, there is a Royal Parks group, and they would then say to me, well, these are the issues. And I would rather look at the Royal Parks and say, well, I don't want to listen to one group's views about it. I don't want to listen to the nearest neighbors. I want to look at it as a set of parks, a set of roads, and say, what does it tell me? What could it be? And what are the problems? I even looked at Buckingham Palace, and I often have said that the opinions of the royal family are only one of many. And I looked at how that area in front of it could be better, become a better public space than it is. One of the areas I looked at was the Thames Gateway. And this was a large estuary outside London, leading into London. It was declared a regeneration area by the government. But I looked at it totally independently, and I came up with a picture on the box, which is assembled all the proposals. So I didn't have a vision, a personal vision for it. I assembled everybody else's vision like a jigsaw puzzle. So I made the picture. I felt very much that people were trying to put their pieces of the jigsaw together, but didn't have a picture on the box. And I think to do a jigsaw, as everyone knows, you have to have a picture on the box. And as a result, the government did listen, and I argued very successfully at the time that landscape was the first engineering. It wasn't engineering, it wasn't house shortages, it was actually remedial works to landscaping. And we got £70 million funding, which was launched in a booklet by Boris Johnson. He didn't actually come up with the client side, he only just inherited it. But we had got an awful lot of funding and new initiatives that carried through. The other thing I'm fascinated by is just looking at roads. Who organizes that road? What is that road all about? For example, I looked at the number of people. We tried to do an estimate with students of how many people are walking on a road. This is a very busy road, the Marylebone-Euston Road. And how many people were in vehicles. And we estimated there were 10 times more people walking than there were in the vehicles. And that's very significant because the traffic lights don't reflect that. The surface crossings don't reflect that. And as a result, we've got at least 10 new pedestrian crossings added to what's provided. We've had all kinds of new projects started along them. And one of them we were commissioned to do, and this is Regent's Place, which is a large master plan where we built 3 buildings. But in particular, we looked at, there is a crossing at one of the junctions, and we completely changed the crossing, a 4-way crossing, to give precedence to the pedestrians, greater precedence, and reprioritize how that worked. A very, very fascinating example of urban design or architecture, and the way it is often made a choice between the two, was the Home Office. You see in this picture on the left, 3 large slab blocks above a podium, which made the whole 2 urban blocks impenetrable. And then you see the other image is what we were then able to build as a result of agitating and arguing and we're demonstrating. And indeed, this image on the left has more floor area than the image, sorry, the one on the right has more floor area than the old buildings that we managed to pull down, which destroyed the view of the Houses of Parliament. The new urban quarter had just as much office space, but added a considerable number of apartments, which you see on the street frontage, and it had pedestrian permeability. There are 2 routes through it. We also, the architecture we felt was very much a backdrop. We had 15 different artists on the canopy, on the front image, and even the balustrade at the front was designed, a functional thing was designed by artists. And these are the ways through that permeability through the complex, so that there was bridging at the upper floors above the pedestrian concourses that go through it, so you get permeability. And so I think that this issue of urbanization is the biggest one in the world at the moment, because city growth, city making is the biggest business of the 21st century. Britain itself will grow by, it will have the largest population in Europe. London itself is going to grow by 2 or 3 million. We have done big picture thinking about London because we put them out there. We volunteer them. No one asks for them. And I think place as client means that we have to think, all us professionals, about not waiting for a client, say what we think ought to happen. And often, I think the thought is not only a better way of thinking, very often, it is also just puts on the table another choice. And our office here in Hong Kong is putting on the table another idea to challenge the one which is put on the table. I went to LegCo on last Saturday to argue for being more choice. I felt that it wasn't interactive enough. What was happening was, this is on the table, this is the plan, please comment for 3 minutes each. And there were about 25, 30 of us, all had 3 minutes each to comment on this plan. And so what we did was, I took my 3 minutes explaining another plan, just to put on the table, so that instead of just commenting on the plan that the government has, which repeats itself all over the world at the moment, I think it's important that we all come up with our own ideas and argue for them. And so in the end, we produced a leaflet on this, which in true places client manner, we have available. And this is how you get ideas out there and how you have a truly participatory interaction about the future of places. Thank you very much.